Hey everyone, my name is Chris Castaldini. I am the Global Director of Sales Development here at Optimizely. So excited to be with all of you today. Thank you so very much for attending my webinar session. I know there were many to choose from. I do appreciate your time and support. I am presenting today from the beautiful headquarters here of Optimizely in San Francisco. What we'll be talking about today is compensating SDRs on pipeline. And some of the arguments for and against that. And I hope you find this to be very valuable, informative, and I do welcome any comments or questions that you have. My information will be at the end of the presentation here today. Feel free to reach out. In fact, I welcome all of you to do that. I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much. Let's get started. So in terms of an agenda, I do think it's very important for us to start off with things that we should all consider before making this decision. We'll then get into some of the pros and of course, some of the reasons against or the cons, if you will, for making this decision and compensating your SDRs on pipeline. And then we'll briefly get into some of the recommendations that I have based on some of the learnings that I've experienced here, specifically Optimizely, as well as in former roles and companies. And then I'll walk you through the impact that this decision has had on not only me and the team, but also on the organization at large. So what should we all be thinking about before we decide to make this decision? First and foremost is we need to fully understand where we want our SDRs to spend their time and quite frankly, where we need them to spend their time. If you're an early stage company and you're starting to build out your SDR team or your AE organization, you want to make sure that I believe that you're spending as much time creating meetings, at bats, if you will, just to make sure that your AEs are busy and your SDRs are busy and feeling motivated. If you're a mid-stage organization like Optimizely or even a late stage for that matter, volume is absolutely still important, but you do want to focus more of your attention now on quantity over quality, and you want to make sure that the pipeline that you get is with the right accounts at the right time and that this business is going to eventually close and renew. And by compensating SDRs on pipeline, I feel like that's a good way of doing that. Of course, I think with any comp plan, but absolutely with pipeline, if you want to make sure that your conversion rates are healthy throughout the funnel too, right? So you got to look at SAO conversion rate. You got to look at conversion rates even further up the funnel in terms of even lead to SAL, right? You got to analyze those very, very closely to see if it makes sense to be compensating on pipeline. You also need to understand currently where are the AEs estimating pipeline within the process now. Is it early in the sales process? Is it later in the sales process with some of the processes or policies in place in terms of estimating pipeline? If a deal goes in early on, are the AEs going to be questioned or scrutinized? These are all things that you need to think about because it absolutely has an impact on if this is the right decision for you or not. Naturally, close rate is incredibly important because that ultimately determines how much pipeline coverage you need, right? And if your close rate is incredibly healthy, then you might not want to have the SDRs focus on pipeline, right? You might want them to focus on just getting deals through so the AEs can go work their magic. However, if you're like most companies and your close rate is, let's say 30%, then you're going to need at least 3 or 4x pipeline coverage in order to satisfy your revenue goal. So focusing the SDRs on that particular component, I think, is very valuable as well. And then lastly, the SLA is so absolutely critical. If you don't have that SLA in place, you don't have the criteria, the policies, if the leadership team hasn't bought off on it, et cetera, then you shouldn't even consider compensating on pipeline because you need to have that documented first. You need to have that enforced at all levels first before you can even consider doing something like this. So why does this make sense? Why did it make sense for Optimizely? Why did we decide to do this at the beginning of Q3? And I think there are a few reasons for that. We'll go through this right now. It absolutely drives tight alignment at the AE and the company level. It absolutely promotes the right behavior, not only within the SDR organization, but I think broadly across go-to-market. It is incredibly motivational for the SDR team. I've seen this firsthand, which is why I'm a huge proponent of it. It does provide the SDRs exposure into this next role, which I think is valuable as well, since the majority of SDRs want to get into a selling role eventually. Obviously, very easy to quantify the impact if you're being compensated on pipeline. It's very real. You know that the dollars that you are generating are eventually getting closed, and that, again, it's very easy to quantify the level of impact or contribution that you're having on the business. And then I do believe it does extend time and seat, and it's essentially an aggregate of all of these that allows that to happen. So let's get into some of the more details for each. So the AEs and SDRs, like I mentioned, are absolutely hyper-focused on the best accounts whenever an SDR team is compensated on pipeline. If they're just going out and getting meetings, they don't really care who those meetings are with. A meeting is a meeting is a meeting. But if you've got a metric that tries to quantify again the value or the level of contribution that SDR's activity is having on the business, it absolutely drives alignment. And then from a company perspective, obviously a firm believer owning this function that pipeline is one of the most important leading indicators for future success and growth for the business. So by comping the SDR team on pipeline, the company can ensure that those individuals are focused on this very important metric. From a good behavior standpoint, SDRs will absolutely do everything in their power to increase the size of the deal, or at least impact the size of that deal. They're going to do that through greater degree of qualification. They're going to do that through further outreach, through maybe even more strategy with their AEs. But any way that they can, again, increase the size of that deal, impact the size of that deal, which would allow them to get to their quota faster, they're absolutely going to do that. And then being an AE myself for over 10 years, I know that it's very challenging to stay on top of every single deal. It's very challenging to make sure that every deal is moving through the sales process. So I firmly believe that if you compensate an SDR team on pipeline, those SDRs are going to help, right? They're going to stay on top of the deals. They're going to stay on top of the AEs. They're going to make sure that those deals are in fact moving through the sales process, and that the AEs are doing everything that they can to get those deals done and closed. And by comping again the SDRs on this particular metric, I believe allows everyone to do that very efficiently. From a motivational standpoint, I think this one is very, very clear. I think if all you're doing is comping an SDR, let's say on just meetings and opportunities, a meeting is a meeting, an opportunity is an opportunity. There's no way to really quantify that. However, if you can very clearly show that an opportunity is worth, $500,000 to the business in terms of pipeline generation, and that SDR, like we do here at Optimizely, can literally walk up to the whiteboard and stick that figure up on their their tile, if you will, and almost boast a little bit and get a little bit of pride out of that. It absolutely motivates them to sit back down and go find the next one, right? Related to that, if your colleague next to you just landed a big deal, it's absolutely going to put a little fire under their rear, right, and get them to continue to push hard and go find the next big deal. So it's going to promote that healthy degree of competition across the team, which I think is very important for any selling or sales development organization. In terms of exposure to next role, I do think there's a lot of value in getting SDRs used to this idea of having a dollar quota, right? Because every SDR looks at sellers and say, oh man, I can do that role, right? I can do that better than them. I can sell better than them. I can make as much money or more money than them, but they don't really understand some of the nuances and pressures associated with the role and then associated with having a dollar quota specifically. And by doing so, by comping the team, the SDRs on pipeline, it gets them used to those nuances, gets them used to the expectations associated with having a dollar quota. And I think it's incredibly valuable from a career and professional development standpoint. We touched on this a little bit already, but an opportunity is an opportunity if all you're doing is comping on numeric volume. But if you're associating a dollar value with that, then the SDR knows that this opportunity is worth this much to the business, and it's very, very clear in terms of the level of impact and contribution that they're having. It becomes especially true naturally if that deal closes, which I think everyone was, right? You ring the gong, you get excited about it, but if the SDR, you're like, damn, I actually brought that deal in and it was worth $500,000 and it closed for $1 million when the deal actually was done. I think that is very, very important for an SDR, and it's again a very easy way for them to quantify the impact that they're having on the business. And then bringing all of those together, right? You've got the tight alignment, you've got the great behavior. It's incredibly motivational. They're getting exposure. They're continuing to be enabled and developed. And then it's very easy to quantify the impact. You bring all of those together, you've got a great recipe for success. And as a result of that success, I do believe that it extends the amount of time that the SDR wants to be in the role, which I know, at least for me, is something that I think about quite a bit. It seems like people are trying to move into selling roles even sooner now, within 8, 10, 12 months. So if I can extend that out even by a few months, if it's 18 months, if it's 2 years, because they're making money, they're feeling good, they're feeling like they're having an impact to the business, I think that's a win-win for everybody. But look, it's not all rose-colored glasses, if you will, right? There are absolutely challenges associated with it, and quite candidly, we experienced some of these challenges ourselves when we decided to make the change at the beginning of Q3 to comping the team on pipeline. So let's walk through some of those right now. First one is gaming the system. Yes, you're probably thinking, Chris, like you can game any compensation plan. That's really nothing unique and has nothing to do with pipeline generation. You're probably right, but I would say that challenge or issue is magnified a little bit when you comp on pipeline, because naturally it's very easy for an AE to go in and potentially inflate or maybe even deflate, right? Depending on the relationship of their that they have with their SDR. And that is very, very real to the bottom line of the business. So we'll absolutely talk about that. Lower volume. I touched on this earlier, right? Maybe you're in a situation where you want to have more volume through, you want to have meetings, you want to get more at-bats for your AEs. By comping on pipeline, you do run the risk, especially if those deals get big, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Unless they're not closing, you do run the risk of lowering the amount of volume of meetings and opportunities that come through. There's ways for us to address that. Targets, of course, there's always a risk to getting targets wrong. However, what I mean here is I think identifying the targets in terms of pipeline is quite easy. You just work backwards from revenue. But if you get those wrong, or if you're not really accurate in terms of the level of deals that you anticipate going in, or if there's a spike in big deals, you can find yourself in a situation where you're paying the SDRs on pipeline that, one, maybe is not real, or two, you're paying them very quickly because they're getting bigger deals and they're satisfying their quotas sooner. So if you're not anticipating this, or you haven't done the analysis well enough, then you absolutely expose the business to kind of some financial pain, at least in the short run. And then in terms of tension, there's absolutely some tension that exists whenever you pay SDRs on pipeline, because it requires the AEs to do a little bit of work and make sure that they're trying to estimate pipeline at a realistic level early in the sales process, and that, of course, creates some tension. So let's go through these in more detail. So gaming the system, like I mentioned, very easy for an AE to potentially inflate the pipeline. knowing that the SDR is being compensated on it, especially if that partnership or that relationship is very tight. You can see that happening. There are absolutely ways for you to address that, though. So I do think it's somewhat of a lesser issue. I mentioned volume, right? So there's two hyper-focus on pipeline. There is the chance that they are going to potentially reduce the volume of meetings or opportunities. If that happens, especially if you're a growing organization or if you're trying to make sure that all of the AEs are business within the selling organization, then that is absolutely a challenge that you want to try to anticipate and mitigate. I mentioned this as well. The unpredictable nature of pipeline can impact the targets and the ability to reach targets, right? Both good and bad. So it's absolutely something that you want to be aware of. And then this tension one is real and something that we experienced here at Optimizely. And that is by requiring the AEs to estimate a pipeline figure early in the sales process when there might be little to no information, maybe just enough to qualify that as an opportunity, then it does cause tension, right? Because there's some hesitancy about putting big deals into the pipeline. The SDRs want to make sure that the absolute biggest deal possible goes into the pipeline. So there's kind of this imbalance, if you will, between those two functions, and as a result, they, some tension or some frustration can potentially exist as a result of that. Good news is, though, I do have some recommendations in terms of things that you can potentially do or think about or implement sooner to address some of these. So we'll go through those right now. In terms of recommendation here for gaming the system, it's absolutely imperative that you are regularly auditing the deals as they come in. We've got a policy here that as soon as a deal hits a certain threshold, a flag goes off within Salesforce, and we check the validity of that deal. We ask the AE and the SDRs just some kind of basic questions to make sure that's in fact relevant. The SLA, of course, is going to impact this as well. You just want to make sure that that process is super tight to minimize as much gaming that you can. Also, too, if you're set up this way, you could potentially even automate how the pipeline is estimated or generated in Salesforce. We're in the process of thinking through that right now, whereby an opportunity goes in based on kind of historical figures, if you will, then the deal is automatically estimated. This wouldn't replace the AE's ability to go in and estimate their own deal. I think you still need that, but this would be an automatically generated figure that you could either audit against the AEs to see how close you are, or you can just simply pay the SDR on that particular automated number. So you can, again, try to minimize some of the inflation or deflation that could potentially happen. From lower volume perspective, I would absolutely not encourage any of you to compensate just exclusively on pipeline. You need to have another variable to balance that out. I'm sure most of you know this already. The variable that we use or component that we use here at Optimizely is meetings. So that is our quantity metric, and then we use pipeline generation as the quality metric, and it seems to work incredibly well for us. In terms of getting the targets wrong, I think the recommendation that I have there is just make sure that you're structuring the comp plan right. Set a cap in terms of pipe gen so you can minimize the amount of exposure that you have. I think it's a very easy thing to do, right? And the SDRs might not be happy about it, but you absolutely need to put safeguards in place to make sure that if a big deal comes in, especially if that deal doesn't close, that you're not overpaying on revenue that actually doesn't have any impact to the business from a revenue standpoint. And then lastly, in terms of tension, again, this is a very real one for us. What we decided to do in Q3 was pay on stage one. Something that we're considering as we're moving into next year is to prolong that. So maybe pay at stage 2 or even stage 3 to make sure that the deal is real and that the AE has some information. So if in fact that deal is large as it goes into the pipeline, that they're able to back that up, they're able to defend that they're able to answer some questions that they might get from senior management. So what did we notice here at Optimizely? We are in a situation that is quite good, but we're absolutely not at great yet. There are things that we need to do. Some of the benefits that we noticed early on was our performance nearly doubled quarter over quarter from Q2 to Q3. The pipeline generation being a component of comp plan absolutely wasn't the only reason why this happened. But I do feel that having that component in there did have a positive impact on my team's ability to perform and feel really good about what they're doing. Pipeline gen did increase quarter over quarter, which of course is great despite some challenges that we were experiencing across the business and in the team. The SDRs absolutely felt way more engaged, excited, motivated, enthusiastic about the role as a result, if you will, of being comped on pipeline. I've heard this numerous times. Every time I suggest that we might take pipeline away as a variable component, they get all tissy, if you will, right? So this absolutely had an impact on kind of morale and engagement, which I think is incredibly important. And then something that we track very closely are deals over 100K. The number of those deals more than doubled quarter over quarter. So we are absolutely driving bigger deals into the pipeline. And this is in part due to the fact that our SDRs are now focused on driving pipeline as a part of their compensation plan. In terms of challenges, and there were a few that we absolutely saw, pipeline, even though it didn't increase as much as we anticipated. We're still trying to figure out why, but one reason why I think that is as soon as you compensate a team on a particular component, especially pipeline, there's going to be a bit more sensitivity around that, right? Because there's a real dollar, a real commission associated with it. And I think as soon as we made that change, the AEs were a bit more, I wouldn't say thoughtful, right, but a bit more sensitive because they knew that there was, a dollar commission associated with it. The AE leadership was, of course, interested in that very same nuance, as well as our customer sales operations, right? So there's almost like this psychological impact when you comp people on pipe gen. You want to make sure that pipe gen is in fact true and that it's correct. I mentioned this, the AEs were getting really frustrated with having to estimate pipeline early on in the sales process. Again, we're making changes here internally to address that, but it was a real challenge for us. And then as a result of those frustrations, those kind of percolated up into the sales leadership here within Optimizely. And not that it wasn't anything that we couldn't address, but that was a frustration that we've been talking about and are taking steps now to address as a company. So guys, I hope that was really valuable, informative, insightful. I don't know if you're thinking about comp plans. I'm sure you are as you're moving into next year, but I would highly recommend compensating on pipeline, especially if you are a mid-stage organization focused on high quality, sustainable, scalable, renewable business like we are at Optimizely. I do firmly believe that it could be a really good decision for you. But you might disagree, you might have questions, you might have comments. Feel free to reach out through any of these mediums. You've got my LinkedIn, email, and phone. Feel free to call, text, email, whatever you need to do. I'd love to hear from you. Also, too, if you thought that this was interesting, valuable, informative, I encourage all of you to share it. You see the hashtag there. Go ahead and mention me through whatever medium that you want. I would appreciate it. Thank you again for spending some time with me today. Thank you to InsideSales.com for hosting the Sales Development Summit. And thank you to all of you as leaders and as individual contributors within the function for everything that you do to promote this function within not only our industry, but within our companies. What we do is so critical. And I appreciate all of the effort and support. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.